You pray, yet something still feels heavy inside your mind. You ask God for peace, but the noise in your thoughts keeps returning when the room gets quiet. You tell yourself you'll change. You'll become disciplined, focused, spiritually strong. But somehow, after every promise, you return to the same habits again, the same distractions, the same emotional exhaustion, the same hidden battles nobody knows about. And the frightening part is, from the outside, your life may look completely normal. You smile, you talk, you work, you worship, you laugh with people. Meanwhile, inside your mind, something keeps draining your strength, little by little. A war nobody can see. A tension that follows you into the night. A constant pull between who you are and who you know you should become. Because there are moments, especially late at night, when your thoughts begin moving faster than your peace. You replay conversations that already ended. You remember mistakes you thought you buried. You feel guilt without fully understanding why. You feel tired, even after resting. You feel surrounded by people, yet emotionally alone. And sometimes, the hardest part is trying to explain a battle you cannot physically describe. But what if this struggle is deeper than stress? What if your exhaustion is connected to something happening internally? Something ancient scripture described long before modern psychology existed? Because according to the Bible, there is a version of you constantly fighting for control. A version of you that feeds on comfort, feeds on impulse, feeds on distraction, feeds on emotional chaos, feeds on temporary pleasure while quietly destroying long-term peace. And every single day, that version grows stronger or weaker, depending on what you repeatedly practice in secret. That is why two people can hear the same sermon, pray the same prayers, read the same Bible, yet live completely different lives internally. One slowly becomes clear-minded, disciplined, emotionally grounded, spiritually awake, while the other becomes mentally scattered, easily tempted, emotionally unstable, constantly drained, constantly fighting thoughts they cannot control. The difference is often hidden in daily habits, small decisions, private behaviors, repeated patterns, because habits are never neutral. Every habit feeds something. And what most people never realize is that the flesh does not destroy your life all at once. It happens quietly. A little compromise here, a little distraction there, a little emotional avoidance, a little spiritual laziness, until one day you wake up feeling distant from God, distant from yourself, and unable to explain how you arrived there. This is why some people keep praying for freedom, while repeatedly feeding the very thing keeping them trapped. And this next part changes everything, because the Bible does not only reveal the problem, it also reveals 6 habits powerful enough to weaken the flesh, strengthen the spirit, restore clarity to the mind, and transform the inner life of a person completely. But most people never stay consistent long enough to understand what these habits actually do, because these habits will force you to confront parts of yourself you have been avoiding. Your hidden cravings, your emotional wounds, your need for distraction, your pride, your impulses, your secret addictions, your fear of silence. And one of these habits in particular is so uncomfortable that most people quit before transformation begins, because it exposes something about human nature that many never want to face. So before this video ends, you may finally understand why your mind feels under constant pressure, why peace feels difficult to maintain, why discipline feels exhausting, and why the greatest spiritual war is often fought in complete silence. Because maybe the real battle was never only around you. Maybe the real war has been happening inside you this entire time. There's a side of human nature that wants relief more than growth, comfort more than truth, pleasure more than peace. And most people spend their entire lives feeding it, without realizing what it is doing to them internally. The Bible calls it the flesh. But the flesh is far deeper than most people imagine. It is not merely your body. It is the survival-driven part of you that resists transformation. The part that wants immediate comfort, immediate pleasure, immediate emotional escape. The part of you that says, tomorrow, later, one more time, one more distraction, one more compromise. Because the flesh does not think long-term. It reacts. It craves. It avoids discomfort. And if you pay attention carefully, you can actually watch it operate inside your daily life. It appears in the moments nobody else sees. When your hand reaches for your phone without thinking, when silence feels uncomfortable, when boredom immediately becomes stimulation, when emotional pain instantly searches for escape, food, entertainment, attention, validation, scrolling, noise, anything that prevents stillness, anything that prevents confrontation, anything that keeps the mind occupied long enough to avoid what is happening internally. And this is why so many people feel mentally exhausted now, because modern life constantly feeds the flesh. Every notification trains urgency. Every distraction trains impatience. Every endless stream of stimulation trains the brain to crave quick emotional rewards. Meanwhile, the ability to sit quietly, focus deeply, pray consistently, control impulses, or endure discomfort begins weakening little by little. And this is where the struggle becomes deeply personal, because the flesh does not always appear destructive in obvious ways. Sometimes it appears comforting, sometimes it feels harmless, sometimes it even feels deserved. That is what makes it dangerous, because the flesh often disguises self-destruction as relief. A person says they are relaxing, but internally they are avoiding themselves. A person says they are coping, while slowly becoming dependent on distraction to escape emotional discomfort. A person says they are fine, while their inner world quietly collapses under pressure. And eventually, as the mind begins losing its ability to rest naturally. That is why some people can sit in silence for only a few seconds before reaching for stimulation again, because stillness forces confrontation. And the flesh hates confrontation. It wants escape. This is why the Apostle Paul wrote words that still disturb people thousands of years later. The good I want to do, I do not do. And the evil I do not want to do, that I keep doing. Paul was describing a divided mind, a war between intention and impulse, between conviction and craving, between the spirit trying to rise and the flesh trying to remain in control. And what makes this frighteningly modern is how many people understand this battle emotionally. You know what is healthy for you, yet resist it. You know what is destroying your peace, yet return to it. You know what needs to change, yet something inside keeps pulling you backward. That tension is the internal war Paul described. And today said, that war is amplified by constant stimulation, because the flesh grows stronger every time discipline weakens, every time impulses go unquestioned, every time discomfort is escaped immediately, every time emotions become the ruler of behavior, and slowly, without realizing it, people begin losing authority over their own minds. Pause. You can actually see this happening everywhere. A person scrolling endlessly late at night while feeling emotionally empty. A person praying while secretly exhausted internally. A person smiling publicly while privately collapsing under anxiety, shame, fear, or hidden habits they cannot control. And the terrifying part is, many people look spiritually alive on the outside, while internally becoming weaker every day, because the flesh grows strongest in secrecy, in hidden patterns, private compromises, repeated indulgences, silent addictions, unchallenged thoughts, and the longer it remains unexposed, the stronger it becomes. That is why transformation is painful at first, because the flesh experiences discipline as a threat. The moment you begin resisting impulses, the moment you begin denying comfort, the moment you stop feeding constant stimulation, something inside you reacts immediately. Restlessness increases. Cravings increase. Emotions surface. The mind searches desperately for escape. And this is why the first habit feels almost violent to the mind. One meal has never controlled your life until you try to stop eating. That is when something unexpected happens. The body reacts, the mind reacts, your emotions react, and suddenly, what felt completely normal yesterday now feels difficult to live without. Because fasting does something uncomfortable to the human mind. It removes the distractions that normally keep deeper struggles hidden. And when those distractions disappear, you begin hearing parts of yourself more clearly. The silence becomes louder, your cravings begin speaking, your impatience becomes visible, your emotions surface, your thoughts become restless. You start realizing how often your mind depends on stimulation just to feel stable. And for many people, that realization is disturbing. Because most people believe they are in control of themselves until they intentionally deny themselves something. Food, entertainment, noise, pleasure, constant scrolling, constant consumption, constant stimulation. The moment those things are removed, another voice begins demanding attention. A restless voice, a frustrated voice, a desperate voice that wants comfort immediately. And this is why fasting feels deeply uncomfortable at first, because fasting exposes dependency. Not only physical dependency, but emotional dependency. Many people are not eating because they are hungry. They are eating because they are anxious, because they are emotionally drained, because silence feels too heavy, because food becomes emotional relief, the same way some people use entertainment, or music, or social media, or endless conversations, or constant background noise, anything to avoid being alone with their own thoughts for too long. Because confrontation is difficult, especially internal confrontation, especially when the mind has spent years escaping itself. And this is where fasting becomes far more psychological than most people realize, because fasting interrupts automatic behavior. It exposes compulsive patterns. It reveals how quickly discomfort controls decisions, how quickly cravings influence behavior, how quickly emotions begin negotiating with discipline, and suddenly, you notice something frightening. The flesh always wants relief now, not later. Now. That is why discipline feels painful to the mind at first, because the flesh interprets denial as danger. The moment comfort disappears, it reacts immediately. The mind becomes irritated. The emotions become unstable. Thoughts become louder. Small frustrations feel bigger, and hidden impulses begin surfacing from places you did not expect. This is why some people become more emotionally aware during fasting, because fasting removes the anesthesia. It reveals what constant stimulation was covering. And this is exactly why fasting appears repeatedly throughout Scripture, not as religious punishment, but as spiritual exposure. Even Jesus entered the wilderness and fasted before beginning his public ministry. Think about that carefully. Before miracles, before crowds, before influence. Before power was revealed publicly, there was isolation, hunger, weakness, silence, and then the attacks came. Not before weakness, after weakness. Because exhausted minds become vulnerable minds. That is one of the most overlooked psychological realities in the Bible. The enemy approached Jesus when his body was depleted, when comfort was absent, when hunger was intense, because moments of weakness often reveal what truly controls the human heart. And the temptations themselves were deeply psychological. Turn stones into bread. In other words, relieve yourself immediately. Use your power to satisfy your cravings. Escape discomfort now. That temptation still exists today. Only now. The bread has changed forms. Now it becomes endless distraction, instant entertainment, pleasure on demand, constant stimulation, emotional escape available every second, and the modern mind is drowning in it. People wake up and immediately consume noise. Notifications, videos, messages, music, content. The mind rarely rests long enough to hear itself think clearly, and because of that, many people no longer know how to sit with discomfort. The moment boredom appears, they reach for stimulation. The moment emotional pain appears, they search for escape. The moment silence appears, they fill it immediately. But fasting interrupts that cycle. It forces stillness. It forces awareness. It forces confrontation. And that is why the flesh resists it so aggressively, because the flesh panics when it loses stimulation. The flesh wants comfort constantly. It wants relief constantly. It wants escape constantly. But fasting weakens that control little by little, not instantly, slowly, painfully, quietly. And somewhere in that process, a person begins realizing how much power their cravings actually had over them. That is why fasting is not only about denying food, it is about discovering what controls you, what controls your emotions, what controls your impulses, what controls your reactions, what controls your focus, what controls your peace. Because whatever you cannot say no to eventually gains influence over your mind. And this is why fasting has transformed people for generations. Not because hunger itself makes someone spiritual, but because fasting exposes the hidden attachments competing for control internally. The attachments many people never notice during ordinary life, and once those attachments become visible, the real battle finally begins. Because fasting only exposes the flesh. The next habit begins destroying it. Why do so many people fear silence? Think about that carefully. Why does a quiet room make some people uncomfortable after only a few minutes? Why do so many people reach for their phones the moment life becomes still? Why does the mind constantly search for noise, even when the soul feels exhausted? Because silence removes distraction. And when distraction disappears, something hidden begins rising to the surface. Unresolved pain surfaces, fear surfaces, guilt surfaces, regret surfaces, identity confusion surfaces. Memories return, questions return. Emotions long buried beneath stimulation begin demanding attention. And suddenly, a person realizes they are no longer running from silence. They are running from themselves. A quiet room. No notifications. No music. No videos playing in the background. No conversations. No movement. Just your thoughts. And the parts of yourself you have been avoiding for years. That is where silence becomes frightening for many people, because external noise often protects people from internal confrontation. And modern life provides endless ways to avoid that confrontation. Constant entertainment, constant updates, constant information, constant stimulation. The mind rarely gets the opportunity to slow down long enough to expose what is happening internally. And over time, many people lose the ability to sit quietly with their own thoughts. Not because silence is harmful, but because silence reveals what noise was hiding. This is why some people sleep with the television on, why some people cannot drive without music, why some people panic when they are alone too long, why some people scroll endlessly through content they barely even enjoy, because noise becomes emotional protection, a shield against difficult thoughts, a shield against painful emotions, a shield against confronting unresolved parts of themselves. And the terrifying part is, a person can become so dependent on stimulation that they no longer know who they are underneath it. But Scripture reveals something deeply fascinating, again and again. Jesus withdrew from crowds, away from noise, away from demands, away from constant interaction. He repeatedly entered solitude. Think about that. The Son of God still sought silence intentionally, not weakness, not isolation from fear, intentional withdrawal. Because there are things the soul cannot hear clearly in noise, and maybe that is one reason modern minds feel so overwhelmed now, because people are constantly consuming information, but rarely processing their inner condition, always reacting, always absorbing, always stimulated, but almost never still. And this next part changes the way many people understand emotional exhaustion. Because sometimes the issue is not lack of activity, sometimes the issue is lack of stillness. The mind was never designed to remain overloaded every waking moment. Yet many people move from screen to screen, conversation to conversation, thought to thought, without ever becoming internally quiet. And eventually, the soul becomes tired in ways sleep cannot heal. This is why some people wake up exhausted emotionally, even after resting physically, because mental noise never stopped. Internal tension never stopped. Emotional pressure never stopped. And the Bible contains one of the clearest psychological examples of this through Elijah. Elijah experienced an incredible public victory. He stood boldly. He witnessed power. He overcame fear publicly. Yet shortly afterward, he collapsed emotionally in private. Fear consumed him. Exhaustion consumed him. He isolated himself. He wanted to disappear. And this reveals something many people never expect. One powerful moment does not automatically heal an exhausted mind. A public victory does not guarantee private peace. Some people look strong publicly, while silently breaking internally. And often, they do not realize how emotionally depleted they are until silence finally exposes it. That is why some people avoid solitude completely, because stillness removes performance. There is no audience in solitude, no distractions, no emotional escape, only truth, only awareness, only confrontation, and the flesh hates that environment, because the flesh survives through constant stimulation. It survives through noise, through impulse, through emotional escape, through endless consumption. The flesh becomes weaker the moment the mind grows still enough to observe itself clearly. That is why silence feels uncomfortable at first, because hidden emotions begin speaking, and many people spend years avoiding those emotions instead of healing them. But here is the deeper spiritual mystery. Throughout Scripture, God often spoke after the noise died, not through chaos, not through distraction, but through stillness, after separation, after withdrawal, after silence. Because clarity often arrives when stimulation leaves. And maybe that is why some people cannot hear direction clearly anymore. Not because God stopped speaking, but because their lives became too loud internally, too crowded mentally, too distracted emotionally. Imagine sitting completely alone without reaching for stimulation. No scrolling, no entertainment, no distractions. Just awareness. Just reflection. Just honesty. For many people, that feels harder than physical labor. And this next part becomes deeply uncomfortable, because pride can even disguise itself spiritually. A person can know Scripture, yet remain emotionally immature. A person can pray publicly while secretly resisting correction privately. A person can appear disciplined externally, while internally craving validation from people constantly. That is why pride is so deceptive. It hides beneath appearances, it hides beneath performance, it hides beneath reputation. But eventually, whatever's hidden internally always begins affecting the mind. An anxious need for approval, a fear of failure, an inability to receive criticism peacefully, constant comparison, secret jealousy, emotional defensiveness, and many people never realize. Their exhaustion is coming from the pressure of protecting an identity they were never meant to carry. Because pride protects the ego while destroying the soul. And humility destroys illusion before illusion destroys you. That is why humility feels painful at first. It forces honesty, it removes masks, it removes emotional armor, it exposes insecurity, it exposes fear, it exposes the desperate need to appear in control. But once humility enters the heart, something powerful begins happening internally. The mind softens, defensiveness weakens, comparison weakens, peace slowly returns. Because the soul no longer needs to fight constantly to protect a false image. But there is one habit that exposes the deepest addictions of the human mind. The human mind becomes whatever it repeatedly consumes. Most people never realize how dangerous that truth actually is, because the eyes are never passive. What you repeatedly watch eventually shapes what you desire. What you repeatedly consume slowly trains your thoughts, your emotions, your impulses, your attention span, even your identity. And in a world where stimulation never stops, many minds are being reshaped without realizing it. Every image leaves residue. Every video leaves influence. Every repeated exposure trains the brain towards something. That is why people can slowly become emotionally numb without understanding what happened to them, because the mind adapts to whatever it consumes repeatedly, and modern life floods the human brain with more stimulation in one day than many people throughout history experienced in weeks. Constant images, constant scrolling, constant comparison, constant fantasy, constant temptation. The eyes absorb endlessly, while the soul quietly weakens underneath it. This is why attention has become one of the greatest battles of this generation. Because wherever attention goes, desire follows. And wherever desire grows repeatedly, behavior eventually follows too. That is why many people feel trapped in cycles they cannot explain. A mind overstimulated for years begins struggling with stillness, struggling with focus, struggling with discipline, struggling with peace. Because dopamine-driven living slowly rewires emotional expectations, the brain begins craving intensity constantly. Faster entertainment, stronger stimulation, more distraction, more escape. And ordinary life starts feeling emotionally empty by comparison. This is why some people cannot even sit quietly for a few minutes anymore. The mind immediately searches for stimulation. A screen, a video, a notification, anything to avoid boredom, anything to avoid stillness, anything to avoid confronting what is happening internally. And slowly, the ability to experience deep peace weakens, because the mind has been trained to expect constant excitement. But this battle becomes even more dangerous when desire enters the picture, because the eyes do not merely observe, the eyes train craving. And craving repeated long enough eventually demands expression. That is why lust is far more psychological than many people realize. Lust is not only physical attraction, it is the conditioning of desire, a cycle where fantasy becomes more appealing than reality, where temporary pleasure slowly weakens emotional discipline, where the mind begins consuming people visually instead of valuing them spiritually. And the frightening part is, many people no longer realize how deeply visual addiction is affecting them emotionally. Endless scrolling, secret habits hidden in darkness, constant stimulation late at night, fantasy worlds replacing genuine connection, and over time, the mind begins changing. Attention span weakens, patience weakens, emotional sensitivity weakens. Real relationships begin feeling harder to maintain. Real peace becomes harder to experience, because overstimulation numbs the soul gradually, and what once shocked the conscience eventually starts feeling normal. This is why the story of David and Bathsheba is psychologically terrifying, because David did not fall all at once. It began with a glance. One moment, one visual fixation, one unchecked desire, but that glance did not remain a glance, because desire grows when entertained mentally. One glance became obsession. Obsession became rationalization. Rationalization became action. Action became destruction. And by the time David fully understood the damage, multiple lives had already been affected. That is how unchecked desire operates. Quietly at first, then progressively stronger, because the eyes train desire, and many people underestimate how much their environment is shaping their inner world daily. The content they consume, the conversations they absorb, the images they stare at repeatedly, the fantasies they revisit mentally, all of it leaves marks on the mind, even when those marks are invisible at first. And this next part becomes deeply uncomfortable, because many people are spiritually weak, not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack talent, not because God abandoned them, but because their minds are constantly overstimulated. Too much noise, too much visual consumption, too much distraction, too much fantasy, too much emotional escape, and eventually, the spirit struggles to stay strong inside a mind that never rests. This is why guarding the eyes is not merely about rules. It is about protecting attention, protecting peace, protecting mental clarity, protecting the direction of desire itself. Because whatever repeatedly enters the mind eventually influences the soul. And many people are feeding their fears, feeding lust, feeding comparison, feeding insecurity, feeding restlessness, without realizing those same things are shaping their emotional condition daily. Think about how comparison now follows people everywhere. Every scroll becomes another opportunity to feel behind, another opportunity to question your worth, another opportunity to feel inadequate, and comparison slowly creates emotional exhaustion. A person starts measuring their entire life against edited moments from strangers, their appearance, their success, their relationships, their progress, and eventually, gratitude disappears, peace disappears, contentment disappears. Because comparison trains the mind to focus constantly on what it lacks. This is why controlling the eyes is actually about reclaiming the mind, reclaiming focus, reclaiming emotional stability, reclaiming inner clarity. Because whatever controls your attention eventually influences your direction. And many people never notice how much power they have surrendered through constant consumption. They no longer choose what enters their minds carefully. The world chooses for them. Algorithms choose for them. Impulse chooses for them. Craving chooses for them. And slowly, the mind loses discipline. But this next habit is where most people quit, because it attacks comfort itself. Anyone can pray when emotions are strong. Anyone can feel close to God during emotional moments, during worship, during crisis, during inspiration, during pain, during moments when the heart feels awake and alive. But what happens when you feel nothing? What happens when motivation disappears? When emotions become quiet? When passion fades? When spiritual excitement fades into ordinary routine? That is where the real battle begins, because many people unknowingly build their spiritual lives on emotion instead of discipline. And emotions are unstable. They rise, they fall, they shift constantly. So one day a person feels inspired. The next day, they feel distant. And one day they feel mentally strong. The next day, even simple discipline feels exhausting. And when people become emotionally dependent, their consistency begins collapsing every time feelings change. That is why so many people live trapped in cycles. Motivation, action, exhaustion, distraction, guilt. Then motivation returns again temporarily, only for the cycle to repeat, because emotions make unreliable leaders. This is why discipline feels so difficult psychologically. Discipline continues moving even when emotion disappears, even when excitement disappears, even when results are invisible, even when the mind says, skip today, rest today, you can start again tomorrow. And the flesh loves those thoughts, because the flesh craves comfort constantly. Immediate relief, immediate ease, immediate escape from resistance. The flesh does not want consistency, it wants convenience. But transformation is rarely built through convenience. It is built through repetition, quiet repetition, ordinary repetition, the kind nobody applauds, the kind nobody notices, the kind that feels invisible while it is happening. That is why many people underestimate the power of small repeated actions. A short prayer repeated daily, the disciplined thought interrupted repeatedly, a temptation resisted quietly, a habit practiced consistently. Those small moments slowly shape identity, slowly shape character, slowly shape the condition of the mind itself. And this is where the story of Gethsemane becomes psychologically overwhelming. Because Jesus entered that garden fully aware of what was approaching: pain, humiliation, suffering, abandonment, and emotionally, the pressure became so intense that Scripture describes him sweating drops like blood. Think about that carefully. This was not emotional comfort. This was emotional agony, anticipation, pressure, fear pressing against the human nervous system at full weight. And yet, despite the agony, he remained surrendered. That is one of the deepest psychological revelations in Scripture. Obedience continued even when emotion became unbearable. Most people imagine spiritual strength as feeling fearless, feeling powerful, feeling emotionally unshaken. But some of the greatest spiritual moments in history happened while people felt overwhelmed internally. Courage is not the absence of emotional struggle. Sometimes courage is continuing despite emotional struggle. And this is what many people misunderstand about discipline. Discipline is not always dramatic. Often it is painfully ordinary, waking up and praying anyway, reading scripture anyway, resisting temptation anyway, continuing forward anyway, even when feelings disappear, even when motivation weakens, even when nobody notices, because the strongest spiritual moments are often built in ordinary, repetitive obedience, not public moments, private moments, quiet consistency, invisible battles won repeatedly over time. That is where transformation grows. And this next part becomes deeply convicting, because your future is being shaped by what you repeatedly do when nobody sees you. Not occasionally, repeatedly. Your private habits are shaping your mind daily. Your hidden routines are shaping your character daily. The thoughts you entertain repeatedly, the compromises you allow repeatedly, the disciplines you avoid repeatedly, all of it is slowly building someone internally. This is why inconsistency becomes dangerous over time, because inconsistency trains the mind to obey emotion instead of conviction. A person only acts when they feel ready, only prays when emotionally moved, only disciplines themselves when inspired. And eventually, the flesh learns it only needs to remove emotion in order to stop progress. That is why emotional dependency weakens spiritual endurance, because life will not always feel emotionally rewarding. There will be dry seasons, silent seasons, exhausting seasons, confusing seasons, moments where progress feels invisible, moments where discipline feels repetitive, moments where temptation feels louder than motivation. And those are often the moments where identity is truly formed, because consistency reveals what desire cannot sustain. Anybody can start, few people continue. And the flesh understands that. The flesh knows if it can keep you emotionally unstable, you will struggle to remain disciplined long enough to transform. That is why distractions increase when focus becomes serious. Why comfort suddenly feels more attractive when discipline begins growing. Why procrastination becomes louder when purpose becomes clearer. The flesh fights consistency because consistency weakens its control. But disciplined obedience slowly changes something inside a person. The mind becomes steadier. Emotions stop controlling every decision. Impulses lose influence. Resilience increases. Clarity increases. Peace increases. Not instantly, gradually, quietly, through repetition, through endurance, through continuing when feelings disappear. And eventually, the person who once depended entirely on emotion becomes internally stronger than they ever imagined. But the final habit changes the entire battlefield. Most spiritual battles are won or lost in thought patterns. Long before actions happen externally, something has already been repeating internally. A thought, a fear, a memory, a belief. A mental pattern rehearsed so many times, it starts feeling true, even when it is destroying you. Because the human mind is constantly listening to something. Fear, shame, temptation, comparison, condemnation, hope, truth, despair. And whatever voice gains repetition eventually gains influence. That is why some people look calm externally, while internally fighting wars nobody else can see. The mind replaying the same failures repeatedly, the same fears repeatedly, the same embarrassing moments repeatedly, conversations from years ago, mistakes from years ago, regrets from years ago. And somehow, those thoughts continue shaping emotions in the present. This is one of the most mysterious realities of the human mind. A person can physically leave a painful season, while mentally remaining trapped inside it for years, because thoughts repeated long enough become mental pathways, and those pathways begin influencing reactions automatically. Fear becomes instinctive, anxiety becomes conditioned, negativity becomes familiar, hopelessness becomes expected. Eventually, the mind stops asking if something is true. It simply accepts repetition as truth. That is why Scripture says, "Be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Not merely inspired, not temporarily emotional, transformed. Because transformation begins internally before it appears externally. And what makes this fascinating is that modern psychology now confirms something Scripture revealed thousands of years ago. The brain reshapes itself through repetition. Thoughts repeated consistently strengthen pathways in the mind. In other words, what you repeatedly think about, you gradually become more emotionally shaped by. The Bible understood neuroplasticity long before modern psychology gave it a name. This is why negative thought patterns become dangerous over time, because repeated fear conditions the mind to expect danger constantly. Repeated shame conditions the mind to expect rejection constantly. Repeated hopelessness conditions the mind to stop believing change is possible. And eventually, a person starts identifying with their worst thoughts. I'll never change. I'm weak. I'm too broken. This is just who I am. That is no longer just emotion. That becomes identity. And once hopelessness becomes identity, people stop fighting battles they secretly believe they can never win. That is why the enemy attacks identity before behavior, because behavior becomes easier to control after identity collapses. A person who believes they are worthless will eventually live differently. A person who believes they are trapped will eventually stop resisting. A person who believes they are permanently damaged will slowly lose motivation to transform. And many people never realize their deepest battle is not external temptation, it is internal agreement with destructive thoughts. This is why the story of Peter after denying Jesus becomes emotionally devastating. Peter believed he was strong, loyal, fearless. But in one moment of pressure, fear took control. And after denying Jesus, something shattered inside him psychologically. Shame entered. Condemnation entered. Identity confusion entered. Because failure has a terrifying effect on the human mind when shame becomes attached to it. A person stops saying, I made a mistake, and starts believing, I am the mistake. That is where many minds begin collapsing emotionally. Imagine Peter replaying that moment repeatedly in his head. The denial, the fear, the regret, the sound of the rooster crowing, the realization of failure, because shame traps the mind in repetition. The memory keeps replaying. Again, and again, and again. And eventually, the person begins feeling emotionally disconnected from who they once believed they were. That is what shame does. It fractures identity, and many people are silently living in that condition now, smiling externally, while internally haunted by thoughts they cannot escape. Thoughts telling them they failed too many times. Thoughts telling them they are disqualified. Thoughts telling them they will never overcome certain struggles. And over time, those repeated thoughts begin shaping emotional reality. That is why renewing the mind is not optional. It is survival. Because an unguarded mind absorbs darkness constantly, fear constantly, negativity constantly, comparison constantly, lust constantly, condemnation constantly, and eventually, whatever dominates the mind begins influencing behavior naturally. This is why scripture meditation matters psychologically. Not because repeating verses is magic, but because truth repeated consistently begins reshaping mental patterns. The mind slowly learns peace differently, identity differently, hope differently, reaction differently. This is why thought awareness matters, because many people believe every thought deserves agreement. But thoughts can be observed without being obeyed. Fear can appear without becoming authority. Temptation can appear without becoming identity. Negative emotion can appear without controlling behavior. That awareness changes everything, and this is where spiritual focus becomes powerful, because focus determines direction internally. Whatever the mind consumes repeatedly, whatever the mind rehearses repeatedly, whatever the mind magnifies repeatedly, eventually shapes emotional condition. That is why disciplined thinking becomes transformational, interrupting destructive mental loops, rejecting lies repeatedly, returning attention back to truth repeatedly, training the mind intentionally instead of passively, because the mind never stays empty, it is always being shaped by something. And this next truth becomes deeply convicting. You cannot repeatedly feed darkness and expect inner peace. You cannot consume fear constantly and expect faith to remain strong. You cannot rehearse shame constantly and expect confidence to survive. You cannot feed lust constantly and expect purity to grow naturally. Whatever repeatedly enters the mind eventually leaves fingerprints on the soul. But when the mind begins renewing daily, something changes internally. Peace becomes stronger than panic. Truth becomes louder than fear. Discipline becomes stronger than impulse. Hope becomes stronger than shame. And slowly, The person who once felt mentally trapped begins experiencing freedom from the inside outward, not instantly, not emotionally every day, but gradually, quietly, through repeated renewal of the mind. Maybe the greatest battle of your life was never outside you. Maybe the real war was never only about circumstances, people, money, opposition, or visible problems. Maybe the real war has always been happening quietly within you. A war between comfort and calling, impulse and discipline, distraction and focus, fear and faith, flesh and spirit. Because every day, something inside you is being strengthened. Every habit feeds something. Every thought feeds something. Every repeated decision feeds something. Even now, while nobody else can see it, something is growing internally. The question is, what are you feeding most? Because the terrifying truth is this: people do not suddenly become spiritually strong, and they do not suddenly collapse either. Both happen gradually, quietly, through repetition, through habits practiced so often, they eventually shape identity itself. That is why small choices matter more than most people realize. A few moments of distraction may feel harmless. A few moments of compromise may feel temporary. A few moments of emotional escape may feel insignificant. But repeated daily, those moments begin reshaping the mind, reshaping desires, reshaping emotional reactions, reshaping character, until eventually, a person becomes someone they never intended to become. And this is what makes the internal battle so difficult. Most wars announce themselves loudly, but the war of the flesh often happens silently, quietly, patiently. One thought at a time, one compromise at a time, one distraction at a time, one undisciplined habit at a time, until peace begins disappearing slowly, and the soul no longer feels clear. But there is another side to this truth. Transformation also happens quietly. Disciplined practice daily changes people slowly. Prayer changes people slowly. Silence changes people slowly. Humility changes people slowly. Renewing the mind changes people slowly. At first, the changes almost seem invisible. But over time, something powerful begins happening internally. The mind becomes calmer. The spirit becomes stronger. Temptation loses influence. Fear loses authority. Peace becomes more stable. Clarity becomes sharper. Not because life became easier, but because the inner person became stronger. And maybe this entire time, your struggle was never proof that you were weak. Maybe your struggle was proof that a battle was actually taking place, because dead things do not fight. The conflict itself reveals that something inside you still wants freedom, still wants truth, still wants peace, still wants transformation. You're not weak because you struggle. You're human. Every person fights impulses. Every person fights fear. Every person fights distraction. Every person fights internal battles nobody else fully sees. But the habits you repeat daily determine which side grows stronger over time, whether the flesh slowly leads your life, or whether your spirit finally rises stronger. And this next truth is uncomfortable, because the flesh never stops asking to be fed. It always wants more comfort, more distraction, more stimulation, more escape, more pleasure without discipline, more relief without transformation. The flesh is never fully satisfied, but neither is the spirit. The spirit continues longing for peace, for truth, for clarity, for purpose, for deeper transformation. And every single day, your habits decide which voice becomes louder. So maybe tonight, before the distractions return, before the scrolling begins again, before the noise fills your mind again, you need to ask yourself one honest question. Who am I becoming in secret? Not publicly, not performatively, not spiritually in front of other people, but privately, mentally, emotionally? Who are you becoming when nobody sees you? Because eventually, private habits become public realities, and internal battles eventually shape external lives. If this video exposed something you've been fighting silently, write discipline in the comments. Not for attention, but as a decision. A decision to stop feeding the habits, destroying your peace. A decision to stop surrendering your mind to distraction constantly. A decision to strengthen the spirit instead of feeding the flesh daily. And subscribe, because the next video may explain why so many spiritually gifted people battle exhaustion, isolation, emotional heaviness, and silent warfare nobody around them fully understands. Because some battles are invisible, but their effects shape entire lives, and one decision repeated daily can slowly transform the entire human soul.